In the previous two examples, we only saw how to create columns and size them. The rows got created automatically and their heights were based on the content within. But look at this standard layout. A header, a footer, and a main section with not much content in it. This is a grid with 3 rows and 1 column. But why should we use grid in the first place? Because without grid, this is what you get when the main content isn't sufficient enough to push the footer down to the bottom. Let's look at the markup first. We have the header, the section, and the footer directly within body. If we turn the body into a grid container, these 3 become rows, and then we can set appropriate height for each of the rows. Scroll up to the styles, add body selector, add the display grid rule. Now body is a grid container with 1 column and 3 rows automatically. We can inspect to verify the same. Inspect, click on grid. This is right. But before we set some height to the rows, we need to set the height of the body itself. By default, the body element is only as tall as the contents within. But since we want the body to occupy a full viewport height, let's set a min height of 100 VH. This is a very important step. Now let's see if something has changed. And yes, all 3 of our rows have expanded to occupy full screen. Like we learned in the previous episode, since the heights of all these rows together don't add up to the body height, the additional height has been distributed equally among all the rows. So let's change that. The way we used the property grid template columns in our previous examples to specify width of the columns, here we need to use the grid template rows property to specify the heights of the rows. The first value is the height of the header. If you wanted to occupy a specific height like say 100 pixels or 20 rem, you can use that or specify auto. Next, height of the main content. Let's leave it as it is for a moment. Third row is the footer, which again we can use fixed values or specify auto again. Now that 2 out of 3 rows have occupied as much height as needed by the content within, we can assign all the remaining space to the second row using the 1FR value. Remember we learned this in the previous episode? When you want 1 or 2 columns to occupy all the leftover space in the container, you can use the FR units. Same is the case with rows too. Now this is it. We have the main content expanding, making sure that the footer is always at the bottom, irrespective of the content here. View this in responsive mode and notice that whatever is the height of the screen, our footer is still at the bottom. And if the screen height is too small like this, a scroll bar appears just like normal flow. Let's go back to the code. We can of course use grid template columns along with grid template rows too if we need multiple columns and if we want to control their sizing as well. Let's look at another example for the same. A really simple full page menu. For this, we need 3 equal sized columns along with 2 equal sized rows. By now you know how to do this. Here's the markup. A nav element with 6 divs inside for each of the navigation links. This is what it looks like without grid. Now to the nav element, I have already added a height of 100 VH. Now turn this into a grid container, create 3 columns and 2 rows. You can pause the video and try it on your own if you wish to. I'll continue. Display grid. Grid template columns, we need 3 equal sized columns. So 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. And we need 2 equal sized rows as well. 1FR, 1FR. Simple, right? Here, we have it. Inspect the grid. And click on grid, expand this. Let's see what happens if we remove the grid template rows rule here. Did you see that? The rows get auto-sized because this content here in the first row is slightly longer than the second row. the first one occupies more height. In this case, we don't want that to happen, which is why we use the grid template rows property as well to specify that we need both the rows to occupy the same height. Now we can even combine both these rules into a single one by using the grid template shorthand property. Grid template. The first value here is the grid template rows value, which is repeat to 1FR, followed by a slash, and then followed by the grid template columns value, which is repeat 3 1FR. Of course, you can use 1FR space 1FR also. Let's verify if it's still working. Yes, it is. But if the syntax is confusing to you, don't use it. You can keep it as it is. In my opinion, this is more readable anyway. So now you know how to specify sizes for your rows as well as your columns.